What is up, everybody? Welcome to the 4for Formula 1 podcast with the Australian GP recap. As always, I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com, with my man, Dan Weiner, back in the co-pilot seat today, senior producer at BetSperts. Dan, what's up, bud?
Oh, not a whole lot. I think both of us were talking about how we were tired. It was a busy but kind of awesome weekend and dragging a little on a Monday, but we got some Formula 1 to recap, and I'm pretty pumped.
Yeah, man, it was a very interesting race. Obviously, we will get into everything. Before we get into the recap, want to remind everybody that 4for4 is teaming up with Run the Sims for their projection tools and content for both F1 and USFL, DFS, and betting. So go over to runthesims.com, use promo code 4for4 for 10% off USFL and F1 offerings. See the link in the description or go to runthesims.com. If you want to get a preview of what we are going to be offering with Run the Sims, go check out our Australian GP preview show. We had Justin Freeman, the founder of Run the Sims, on the show and showed some of the awesome stuff that they are offering to help us with our lineups. But let's get into the recap. Dan, run us through what you saw, what stood out, what disappointed you, what you liked.
Well, the race was either extremely interesting or extremely boring, depending on your perspective. If you are Charles Leclair, I'm sure it was maybe a little bit boring, but in a good way. Yep. Charles Leclerc becomes the 26th driver in F1 history to win the Grand Slam, the first for Ferrari since Fernando Alonso in 2010. The Grand Slam is P1 in qualifying, the fastest lap of the race, and then winning the race by leading every single lap. He dominated the weekend. However, it wasn't smooth sailing for his teammate Carlos Sainz, who had a bit of misfortune, just bad luck, I would say, in qualifying, starting ninth. He had an issue with his wheel. They switched out his wheel before the race. His car went into anti-stall on the first lap, so he fell to 14th and then got overly aggressive on the second lap trying to make a pass. Ended up spinning out, and his day ended just 2 laps in. On lap 24, Sebastian Vettel, who was making his debut this year, missed the first couple of races because he had COVID, had just an absolutely brutal weekend, couldn't keep the car on the track, and then couldn't do so in the race. He wrecked on lap 24, and that basically created the only real drama in the race. Off that restart, Max Verstappen made his move on Charles Leclerc, but was unable to pass him, and that was basically it at the top of the grid. And then the big thing of the day, the big thing of the weekend, on the 39th lap, for the second time in 3 weeks, the defending champion Max Verstappen, his car just completely spit the bit, caught on fire. They're still trying to figure out what exactly went wrong for him, but he finished out of the race. And then the most interesting thing to me at the end of this race, the thing I'm just completely fascinated by, was the strategy employed by Williams and Alex Albon. If you're not familiar with the rules of Formula One, you have to use 2 different compound tires during the race. You can't just go the entire race on one tire. However, Alex Albon went the first 57 of 58 laps on the hard compound tire, was all the way up in 7th place, took his mandatory pit stop, and held on to finish 10th to get the first points of the season for Williams. So there you can see the finishing positions for this race. Charles Leclerc finishing first, Sergio Perez finishing second, and George Russell, who, believe it or not, is in second place right now in the driver's standings behind Charles Leclerc. A third and fourth for Mercedes, who have proven to be slow compared to Red Bull and Ferrari, but reliable, as Russell and Hamilton have finished every lap of each race so far. The only team to have both drivers finish every lap of every race this season. You see a couple of big improvements there from Albon and Lance Stroll finishing 7th. Albon, by the way, started in last place because he didn't have enough fuel in his car for a post-qualifying inspection. Goes all the way up to 10 places. Then you see at the bottom of the grid some big-time fallers. Carlos Sainz falling 11 spots, Max Verstappen 16, and Fernando Alonso, a guy I think we were all kind of high on this week. We thought the car was fast, but for whatever reason, just could not get things into gear for this race. as you see him finishing down there in 17th place. An interesting race, maybe not the most exciting race from a racing perspective because there really wasn't a ton to sink your teeth into. Leclerc was way ahead of Perez. Perez was way ahead of everyone else. I think there was a joke on Perez's radio about like taking a nap or something. He told his crew if they were asked them if they were taking a nap because he couldn't catch Leclerc and Russell and Hamilton weren't anywhere near him. One other thing that as I'm looking at this, I forgot to mention, hello, McLaren. Welcome to the 2022 season. As both Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo had good performances in qualifying, and even though Lando Norris fell a spot from where he qualified, a 5th and a 6th place for McLaren to finish with both drivers in the points for the first time this season. I think they will take that pretty much every week of the season as they try to chase down Mercedes. So yeah, I mean, like I said, maybe not the most exciting race, but there's a lot of interesting things. And I think as you look at the landscape for DFS going forward, I think there's certainly some things to dig into there.
Yeah, I think the gripe for new fans or casual fans with Formula One is that it is so top heavy, and we've seen this with Lewis Hamilton for 7 straight years that when we have that car or driver that gets way out ahead, there's almost no battling for first place, even though we have seen battles for first place, the first 2 races, and I think and hope that this race in Australia will be the exception and not the norm. But the hardcore F1 fan would say that a lot of the action comes from that midfield, and we did see that in that race a bit. We saw Mercedes and McLaren battling a little bit. We saw Checo had some really good battles with both Lewis and Russell kind of halfway through the race before he separated. So if you had a sweat with DFS, that was really fun. And yeah, as you mentioned, getting McLaren back into the thick of things was really exciting. I don't know if Mercedes is ever going to find the pace to consistently compete for a first place at this point, just with Ferrari looking so good. But I think they're going to be battling for quite a few podiums. I think the rainbow podium is going to be something we're going to be seeing a lot more than maybe we might have expected, or maybe we did expect if we go back thinking Mercedes is going to be good. So that will be exciting. We talked about so much leading up to the second race and this race that we were only 2 races in. Like, there still is a lot that we don't know. And we saw that, McLaren back in the mix, Haas losing a ton of pace. That's a note that we're going to have to pay attention to. Was that expected, with teams that have more money able to do more development than they are after they got off to a hot start. So, still 3 races in, I think we probably still want another 2 or 3 races before we can really be confident in what this midfield looks like. As far as the notes that you mentioned, one thing that I think we talked about before the season started is we don't get a ton of news in F1 leading up to the race. For the most part, after qualifying, if there isn't an incident with a car, if we're not waiting to see if they're going to get a something fixed on a car that crashed, usually not a lot of news. They did briefly mention in the pregame show, like maybe 5 minutes before the formation lap, they were doing something to Max's car. Is that enough time to fix lineups in DFS? Like, maybe you can throw a couple in if you're single entering. Are you going to get off Max if you had him in your captain or driver if you only have one lineup? Probably not. If you're playing 20 to 150 lineups, maybe you can quickly, if we don't have lineup generators yet, we're hoping to get one at RTS, but if you could tweak maybe 5 of your lineups quickly, maybe you do that. But I do think when we see something like that on the grid, it should be enough to move the needle for us regardless of the situation. The time is always going to be an issue when it comes that late on the grid, but sometimes, we had signs 2 weeks ago. We saw him in the garage an hour before it went off. So I think those little garage notes are going to be something interesting leading up to races. And then the Albon thing, there was no way to predict that. We Are the Race had a really good article about that situation. And basically, when they were thinking about pitting, I think, I don't remember if there was a red flag, but I think it was a safety car or something that basically gave them the opportunity to go with that strategy. So it wasn't something we could have predicted. It was an in-race decision, but still exciting nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I think you had the safety car for the two, there were at least three, because you
Yeah.
had three drivers basically not finish the race, and there might have been another one pop out at some point very briefly there, and that certainly was going to affect things. Yeah, I mean, with Verstappen, it's tough because like you want to kind of adjust if you hear some of these things. Okay, maybe they're working on something, but at the same time, like it's always going to feel super risky to be like, okay, well, maybe I can make some adjustments and maybe I'll have a little bit more Leclair, or maybe I will have a little bit more, of my backup kind of chaos lineup. And we'll kind of get into like the conversation we were having off air about maybe the chaos lineup isn't quite as extreme as you think it is, and there might be a path to how you should be going about your contingency plan for if things go crazy, because I think this race was about as realistic as you can expect to see unusual things happen without like a big weather issue or something like that, where it's clear the Red Bull and Ferrari cars are, at least when they're on the track, faster than everyone else by a good bit, but two of those four drivers don't finish the race. And then suddenly now you're looking at, okay, what can happen with your lineup construction? Obviously, if you were heavy on Verstappen, you did not do well. Guilty. That was me.
Yeah, it's hard not to be.
Yeah, I also kind of bought into the Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso. Both had good cars and were unlucky in qualifying. And there was a scenario where both of those drivers could potentially climb up into the top five. And if Alonso, I thought best case scenario for those guys was each going up 5 spots, Sainz into 4th, Alonso into 5th. And at a certain point, there was a lineup construction that you could have where putting those guys in might be a little bit better than having like Leclair or Verstappen, whoever finishes second, I guess, in the race. As unlikely as that may be, I definitely played that as one of my lineups, just as kind of contrarian look, and that obviously that got me absolutely nowhere. But yeah, I mean, I think with the pre-race stuff, I didn't even know that until after the race. Carlos Sainz had his wheel swapped out. Important note for those of you, if these races are on at 1 a.m. and there's a UFC card on somewhere leading into it, maybe pay a little bit more close attention to the F1 pregame show than I was.
Yeah,
because I was watching the UFC card, and I had the pregame on my computer, but I wasn't really paying attention to it because it was like getting close to the main event. So yeah, I mean, it's always doing your due diligence. Like you can obviously very clearly see Yuki Tsunoda not being able to start his car, as was the case in Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
But some of that other stuff might fly a little bit more under the radar in the chaos of, all of the stuff going on the grid. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. We've learned that there's you got to do more diligence before the race than we thought you were going to have to.
Yeah.
But you probably still don't have to if the race is like a 9 a.m. race my time. I don't think I've got to be up at like 5 a.m. checking news and notes the way you might with the NFL, but you still have to kind of keep an eye on what's happening.
Yeah, I think I think you probably want to check Twitter and maybe click the TV on. Should we be saying the telly now since we're playing a European? Maybe 30 minutes before the race. But you also have to take it with a grain of salt. I mean, we also saw Alonso had an issue with his computer system and his car starting, and they were saying that is an issue that could easily pop up during the race, and then it didn't. So, it maybe it's like a coin flip if you are going to adjust. Again, I think if you're playing 1 to 3 lineups and it is a Verstappen or a Leclerc that's having an issue, you probably can't really change anything. If you're playing 20 to 150 lineups, again, maybe you change 5% of your lineups really quickly. But as we're talking about what we can do, let's just jump into the DFS recap. And for the first time this year, we had a solo unique winner. Great username. Pimple Popper MD.
Shout out to Pimple Popper MD.
Shout out
lineup.
Yeah, 14 lineups. Or their 14th lineup. Yeah, came in first for 50K. The interesting aspects to this lineup, obviously, were not obviously, but if you look at it closely, $1,500 left on the table. That's something we haven't seen a ton or from these top lineups. We've seen the lineups using most of the salary at the top for the first couple races. No captain and constructor stack. That's something that we will definitely get into when we get into stacks that did and didn't work. But we were talking leading up to the last two races that it looked like, if you were paying really close attention to how points were being played out, that if there was any shakeup up top, that you were having a lineup that didn't stack captain and constructor was going to be enough to win. And we saw that with Mercedes, and we'll definitely get into that Mercedes constructor choice in a little bit. And then the cumulative ownership, only 144% cumulative ownership if you count Leclerc's ownership as captain instead of his overall 73% ownership. So pretty low cumulative ownership there. Just a very unique lineup. Again, leaving that $1,500 on the table. If you're going to be building lineups, this is what we're shooting for. We're not shooting for, it's nice to chop it 50 ways and get $2,000, but we're playing for this 50K if you're playing the big tournament. If you're playing any tournament, you're playing to not chop first place. So thinking through these lineups and not just looking at what won the first 2 weeks is really how you separate yourself.
Yeah, I'm genuinely curious. I mean, I didn't play in the big league this week again because I was too confused by what was going on. So I can't really look into it. I wonder how many lineups our friend Pimple Popper MD played. I'm just going to try to say that name as many times as I can during the show today. How many lineups this person played, because it certainly feels like, okay, Leclerc, I'm sure they probably had one that was Verstappen instead of Leclerc as the captain with this lineup. I will say, to some degree, I think you can kind of think this kind of, maybe there's some clarity that can be provided when, even though Carlos Sainz has been fast all year, when he starts ninth, and given the history of this track and how hard historically it has been to overtake on this track, even though they've made the changes this year, that maybe it's easier in your mind just to say, well, if I have to choose between like a Sergio Perez or a Carlos Sainz, when we're talking similarly priced drivers, that Sergio Perez seemed like, if you're looking for a more, like, I would say, traditional kind of lineup, then you would have to just assume that Sergio Perez is going to finish better than Carlos Sainz, and Carlos Sainz is going to have to basically reach his maximum potential in this race to outpoint Sergio Perez. We brought it up in our group chat yesterday. George Russell has been the MVP of DFS so far, because 2 weeks in, or 2 of the 3 races this season, he has been in the winning lineup, largely because like we said, he's been reliable. He's able to stay on the track, and that's a huge thing. I was really also kind of hoping with Albon, and I asked, and you shut this down for me. I really kind of hoped that Albon finishing 10th instead of 11th would have swung this in Pimple Popper MD's favor, because obviously, like, Albon, this was the ceiling, like 12 points, like, put it in the Hall of Fame. This is probably the ceiling for Alex Albon, is 12 points. Like, maybe they'll come a point this year where he's 18th to start and something crazy happens and he finishes 8th and he gets the 10-point grid improvement, 5 points for beating his teammate, so on and so forth. And then he gets more points for finishing 8th instead of 10th. But realistically, this is his ceiling, which is 12 points. And at his price, 12 points is an incredible haul. Like, you cannot hope for any better realistically with Alex Albon. And then Stroll, again, like, I played Stroll. I don't think he's a good driver, but I knew how many problems Vettel was having this week, that I leaned Stroll over Vettel in the lineups that I was playing. And you get that bonus with him also going up 7 spots. And then Mercedes, again, just so reliable with both cars finishing. Although one of the things I know we were going to talk about, they still didn't finish that far ahead of Ferrari.
Yeah.
Even though only one Ferrari driver finished.
Yeah. So to your first point about landing on this lineup with Perez, I think I actually just brought it up. Pimple Popper MD played 20 lineups. Okay. So obviously, I could glance and try to figure out like how many he, how often he did each of these kind of iterations. But even if you are only playing, if you're playing one lineup, it could be hard. It could be a tough pill to swallow to make a lineup where you don't have Max or something like that. That's just a function of how much risk you want to take. But if you just think through logically why you would be playing a different constructor when you have Leclair and no Verstappen, like how does this lineup succeed, right? And if Max ends up not finishing ahead of Sergio, he probably had an incident. If you're playing Mercedes instead of Ferrari or Red Bull, you need some kind of chaos. So Perez, not just Perez, having the second driver from one of the main teams in your lineups that don't have one of the big two as your constructor actually kind of makes sense, right? If Mercedes or McLaren is going to have a week where they are the top constructor, you probably need Max or Charles to crash or not finish. So the lineup actually kind of makes sense when you think through it that way. The Albon thing, yeah, I went through the lineups, and even if he finishes 11th instead of 10th, he would have dropped 5 points. There was nobody without Albon within 5 points of first place, so he still would have finished in first. But I do think that we don't have a lineup generator yet at Run the Sims, but if you are playing 20 to 150 lineups, you should have these type of builds in your mix, even if you are heavy on Max and Charles. So let's kind of get into what we were thinking about going into this race. And we did every week. I think it's going to go without saying, we want to be heavy on Max and Charles every week. They're going to be the favorites. They're going to have the fastest car. One thing that the two nuances this week that I think were pretty obvious were you wanted more Charles than Max because it was the first time we saw minus betting odds on a driver all year. He was obviously so much faster on that final lap in qualifying. But we had two Red Bulls starting in the top three with Sainz starting all the way at ninth. So it made sense to be heavier on Leclair, but heavier on Red Bull constructor. The two alternative lineups that we pushed really hard on the preview show were Mercedes and McLaren constructors. They both qualified in the top 10, both of their drivers. On Run the Sims, our projections for our two highest constructors outside of Red Bull and Ferrari were Mercedes and McLaren. And we wanted to continue to exploit these cheap teammate matchups.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I know you talked a lot about Latifi being a popular option, and I cannot wrap my head around the idea of, I played him in a couple of lineups just as a contrarian option, but to me, I cannot figure a scenario out where I'm going to ever feel confident in making that play. And as long as Albon's within a few $100s of him, I can't imagine the extra money that you save playing Latifi is going to end up being something that you're ever going to be super excited about in any given week. Stroll over Vettel is one that's going to be a lot harder, I think, going forward. Just everything in this week seemed to indicate that Vettel wasn't quite there.
Yeah.
I mean, he hadn't raced yet this year, hadn't had a chance to get on the track in the new car in a racing situation, and he struggled all week. So those were both still like the Albon versus Latifi one is going to be one that I think is going to be a pretty simple play every week until they adjust the salaries there. I think Aston Martin, and the simple thing is you just play both Aston Martin drivers in lineups. It's not like you have to make a decision, but if you're trying to limit the number of lineups that you're playing, I don't think that it's going to be an easy decision where you're probably going to want to have to play one of those two guys, because that's really the only way that you're going to be able to fit in a lot of the other drivers that you want. I think other things like that I'm kind of just thinking out loud about, are we going to see a significant adjustment in the Haas price, particularly with Magnussen? Magnussen was kind of up in the midfield pricing. Something's not right with that car. But I mean, I think like a lot of the ideas we had, I mean, we were big on Norris this week, and Norris just kind of, Norris just kind of he had a great race by his standards from a DFS perspective. I don't really know what the best option for playing Norris was that would have given you a lot of success. It certainly feels like maybe we undervalued Checo Perez a little bit, but what are you going to do when there's I guess technically he's finished better than Verstappen twice in 3 races this year, but if they are both on track, he's just not going to beat Verstappen enough that you're going to want to play him over Verstappen, particularly because if you're going to play, unless they qualify 1 and 3, and for some reason you're going to stack them and then use Ferrari or Mercedes as your constructor, like maybe you play it that way, but I don't even know if that's going to be something that is ever going to be worth the investment with the salaries. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I came down with all of it this week. I think we continue to churn out good ideas and things continue to kind of play out in unique ways. Obviously, with Verstappen's car blowing up, that just completely changes the outlook in the game in this. And I guess my question for you is, like, one of the things I was thinking about today is in a weird way, does Verstappen blowing up 2 out of 3 races make him more valuable in DFS because people are going to start maybe adding even more Leclair to their portfolio, whereas maybe Red Bull between now and the time we get to Imola, or maybe we get to Spain, they'll figure some things out, and then suddenly there's going to be a couple of weeks there where people are leaning way more Leclair than they are Verstappen, and then suddenly they get the issues with the reliability figured out, and Verstappen's right back there winning races.
Yeah, I think it's really going to come down. It's going to come down to 2 things, which is always our primary consideration in DFS. One, we have to see what they're going to do with prices. If they skyrocket Leclerc's price, that will really throw a big wrench in everything. If salaries stay similar, it's just going to come down to projected ownership. Obviously, Sergio was on pole in Saudi Arabia, but we saw Verstappen come in at 19% captain. Anytime we're going to get Verstappen, if we start seeing Verstappen coming in at sub 40% overall ownership, sub 20% captain, yes, he is going to start being one of our big targets. And kind of the thing that I wanted to point to, going back to your discussion about Aston Martin and Williams, this is where our partnership with Run the Sims is really going to be super valuable, because it's going to come down to managing percentages. And even if you are only playing 1 to 3 lineups instead of 150, what it's going to show us is who do we expect to be more popular and how can we leverage that. And if Aston Martin and Williams are consistently going to be at the bottom, but we're going to see these huge gaps in ownership, it's going to make it very easy to decide, regardless if you like Latifi or not or think he sucks. If those 4 drivers are starting in the bottom 5 every week and their salaries are all going to be sub 4K or sub 5K, I'm just going to take the less popular one every single week. And this ended up being a big loss for me this week, because we actually thought that the $3,000 versus $3,400 salary for Latifi and Albon was really going to swing things in Latifi's favor, and especially with Albon getting the penalty and finishing 20th. Like, I wonder how many people didn't even realize that, if that had anything to do with the percentages. We were projecting Latifi to be more popular than Albon by a decent amount. It ended up Albon was in 41% of lineups and Latifi was only in 20%, which was very, very surprising. So we're going to dig into that and figure out what happens there. But if we went into the next race and we had the same projection, I would go heavy on Latifi again. I wanted to be heavier on Albon because I thought he was going to be less popular. Unfortunately, that's just not how my lineups worked out. But yeah, we're going to be looking at ownership percentages. To go way back just to one point, I did look at get one more pimple popper MD in here. Out of his 20 lineups, he had 16 Red Bull constructors, 1 Ferrari constructor, and just 3 Mercedes constructors. So he nailed it. If you're with those percentages, you're not going to land on the perfect every time, but he left $1,500 on the table. If you're going to leave max out, put Sergio in, and the rest kind of take care of itself.
Yeah. Also, on a side note, I just discovered Pimple Popper MD's Twitter feed, and he
Okay.
also won a UFC pool on
Oh
Saturday night as
wow,
well.
what a week!
So he's
I
having
got
himself a week. Yeah, I think when it to the Williams thing, and it's what I don't know how sharp the F1 DFS pool is. Like, I don't know how many people who are like you, who it is their profession, it is their livelihood, who are going to be playing Formula One, because I'm assuming most of these people kind of got their start in the NFL, doing football DFS, and may not be as in tune to Formula One and other niche things. Like, I think we're seeing a lot of people, they will shift from NFL once it's over to golf and not Formula One. So perhaps it's not as sharp a player pool as we think it is. And thusly, they're going to think like I think, which I'm not saying is the right way to think about this thing. I'm saying, like, from a DFS perspective, it's not right. But just watching these races every week, it's not a mental block. Like I said, I will play Latifi. Like, I'm coming around to what I'm learning from listening to you and how you approach this, but it's still hard for me to envision myself playing Latifi a lot. And I think you have to listen to smart people who are telling you why it is the prudent decision to do that. And I have done that without listening and having these conversations with you. I probably wouldn't ever play Latifi. And I'm guessing that's probably what this is. It's even though it makes sense to play Latifi from a numbers perspective, you just watch these races and you see a guy who's either finishing last or wrecking every week, and frankly, probably shouldn't even be on the grid. And a lot of people aren't just not going to play. They're going to say, oh, well, Albon and carry it over. Like, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I forgot to look it up. Like, what Latifi's win percentage head to head with Russell was last year wasn't very high. And I think Russell's ceiling as a driver is a lot higher than Albon's, but Albon raced for Red Bull, and he wasn't good enough to keep that seat, but he didn't race badly. He wasn't a bad driver. Like, he was good enough to drive in that car. So he's going to beat Latifi most of the time.
For sure.
And I think people are going to see that. And that's why I think he's going to continue to have value at 3,400. Now, if they push him to like $4,000, then suddenly, okay, now things get a little bit different. And I think people are going to then really have to think twice, because then if it's like, okay, well, I can do Leclair and Verstappen and Latifi, or like Leclair, someone else, and Albon, they're probably going to take Latifi at that point.
Yeah. I mean, there is definitely going to be human error, and there is going to be, name value or name, I guess, misvalue. People are going to just hate certain players in any sport and not want to play them. And yeah, when I think about it, probably crashing in qualifying is going away on people's minds more than what were they starting? 18th versus 20th. Like, people probably aren't putting as much weight into the grid position in that scenario when there's a crash, even though I think they probably should. But it's always just gonna come down to the salary and the ownership, and it is a brand new sport. Like, this is one of the reasons we were super excited about this, is because we hope that the field isn't too sharp. Right. If the prize pools start getting big, it's gonna attract more sharks. But I think for now there are still some huge edges, and we're seeing that a cheaper driver starting ahead of his teammate is in half of the lineups. Like, that's an edge every single day in DFS. Let's talk about some of just the technical things that we saw from a lineup building perspective, both what we wanted to do and what ended up happening. I talked about with Justin, I wanted to be lighter on captain and constructor builds than the first two races for a couple of reasons. One, because it is going to feed into our chaotic lineups, like it was beneficial this week. And two, over the first two races, we saw such a huge percentage of the lineups that cashed and lineups that finished at the top stacky captain and constructor. So I felt that the field was going to start overweighting how important that is. The field still only stacked at 50% of the time. I ended up having less than 50% of my lineups with captain and constructor, and I feel pretty good about that. Still using driver constructor a lot. I'm not saying don't stack. I I still had driver, constructor, at least a driver stack in 100% of my lineups. We saw 99% of top 1% of lineups use at least one stack. It was very interesting. You noted this at the top, and now we're revisiting this point. Ferrari was still almost the top constructor without having two drivers podium or without having two drivers in the top 5. And
without having two drivers in the top 10.
Exactly. So when we are building for chaos, say you have 10 chaos lineups and you have, Leclerc, say you have 10 chaos Leclerc lineups, that doesn't mean you should just not stack Ferrari with him at all, because what can happen is what happened in Australia is that he led every single lap. So those points still almost outpace Mercedes having 2 in the top 4. So just because a team doesn't have 2 drivers finish or 2 drivers finish in the points, that doesn't mean that the constructor can't win. Now, is there going to be any drivers besides Max or Leclerc that have a legit shot at leading every single lap? Probably not, but it makes it worth it to consider that you don't have to completely rule out the idea of stacking your driver with the constructor, even if you are building for chaos.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're going to have to look. And I think Sam put together the notes, and we'll have to go back through and kind of take stock of it for each race, how common overtaking is at each individual track. Because I just did a quick Google search to see if I could find an exact number, and I couldn't find the exact number, but it says over 40% of Formula One races have been won by the pole sitter historically. Mm-hmm. So, if we're at like Monaco, for example, I'll just use Monaco as the example because Monaco is the historically well-known a place where you cannot pass anybody. It is a track that is beautiful. It is historic. It is also the least interesting race of the year because once they start, whatever the order is, basically once they get off the opening start is where it's going to finish in that race. And if Leclerc is on the pole, then you probably need to lean Ferrari over Red Bull as constructor, just because he's going to end up leading more laps. And if Verstappen ends up even in Saudi Arabia, Perez led 14 laps and then he just got unlucky with pit strategy and all of that. But he had a pretty clear lead, and I don't think he would have ended up winning the race, and it would have been a little bit more spread out amongst the drivers. But still, the pole sitter is going to have a pretty big advantage when it comes to just the overall number of laps led in a race, to the point where, and it makes sense for a variety of reasons. One, it's hard to overtake, and 2, if you're on the pole, you probably have the fastest car or one of the 2 or 3 fastest cars, and everything went right for you in qualifying. So that was kind of something that I hadn't even really considered. And I mean, like we said, 20, I don't know the total number of Grand Slams, but only 26 different drivers have ever done it. So, I mean, it's not something that is extremely common, but it is a thing that is possible. And when you look at it right now, if Max Verstappen has reliability issues, and Checo Perez is a great driver, but his car is not as good as Leclerc's. So if Verstappen's going to have reliability problems, then if Leclerc's on the pole, you're probably going to have to consider leaning, if you're just waiting your lineups with Ferrari and Red Bull as constructor, you're probably going to have more Ferrari than you are Red Bull, even if other things happen and extenuating circumstances happen. Obviously, Red Bull would end up finishing with more points than Ferrari if his car doesn't die on him, but it's probably not the significant advantage that you would think that it would have been when one of the Ferrari drivers he finishes in negative points. Yeah. He finished dead last in the race, which means he would finish on -5, right?
Yep.
And they still got 34 points, something crazy, absolutely insane. So yeah, that was kind of something that I didn't even really think about. And then you kind of show the numbers there, and it's oh, okay, well, that absolutely makes sense now. And I think just track by track, when we get to the ones in particular where overtaking is not super common, I think whoever the pole sitter is just somebody that you're going to have to play them. You're going to have to stack them and their constructor. Probably is going to be the winning lineup that week, just because things aren't going to go as crazy as you might think otherwise.
Yeah, it's exciting that's why it's really exciting to have this new DFS sport. We're still figuring out some of these nuances in scoring. How do fantasy points play out based on these different quirks that happen in every single race? How every race is a little bit different, and it's where we're going to just keep finding these little edges and thinking through our lineups in a different way every week, because we're basically getting a crash course, no pun intended, on how DFS plays out in this new sport. So it's really exciting. I think the major takeaway from this segment here, and I think probably one of the most important lineup building decisions that you should be thinking through if you're new to DFS, is we should be mixing up our constructor strategy in terms of if we're stacking them with our captain or not. I think you should have a variable idea of how you're going to do it, whether it's 50-50, whether you're going really heavy on captain or constructor, just thinking in terms of how often you're doing it versus how often the field is doing it. Just that lineup building idea alone is really going to give you at least a very clear guide on how and why you're building certain lineups and how they fit together. Again, stacking Leclair with Mercedes makes sense that Sergio works because Max doesn't finish. Like, logically, can you tell yourself a story that makes sense? One thing that we still haven't seen, and I think is going to pop up soon, is I'm still sprinkling my lineups with double stacks. The field's not doing it at all. Only 15% of the field used 2 or more stacks. Like 3 stacks is crazy, but you can do it. And this graphic, obviously, if you want to look at it, you could go on my Twitter and zoom in. It just breaks down basically how all of these lineups are being built each week, and I think it's a pretty cool resource. But only less than 3% of lineups in the top 1% used a double stack. It's going to take a very specific finish to happen, but I think if you are playing 150 lineups, if you use it in 5 to 10 lineups, I think it's going to give you a unique enough build for when it does land perfect, you can be the new pimple popper MD if that's what you strive to be.
On that note, when you're talking double stacks, like what lineup, just hypothetically, like what lineup double stack could you see working out in your favor and actually being one where you have a lot of success with it?
One that it was pretty tough. It's going to be very salary based. One that I squeezed in last week was I don't remember what constructor was cheaper, if it was Red Bull or Ferrari, but basically you need like a midfield team with a top team stack or vice versa. So something like a Verstappen Red Bull constructor stack, and then like an Ocon Alonso stack. So basically you need them all to finish in the top 4, I think, for it to hit. You need Max Sergio to finish 1-2, and then Alonso and Ocon to finish 3-4, or at least like 3-5 maybe, and that probably takes like a Leclerc to have an incident or something like that. But I think if and when it does play out exactly like that, that's how it hits. It's going to be tough to do because you're going to need two meets with top 5 upside that you can fit together with a top constructor or top driver. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And then if for some reason, like I'm always going to have, I don't know, 5% of my lineups with a crazy winner, because at some point we're going to see, a random team is going to win. Alpine is going to get a win. McLaren's going to get a win. It might only be one all year, but it's going to happen. So you could flip that. You can have an Alonso Alpine stack and then try to jam in Max and Sergio maybe. I don't know if that would work salary-wise, but that's kind of how I'm thinking through those lineups.
So I think this week, you could have given yourself a reasonable chance to pull that off with with captain, constructor, Ferrari or Red Bull, and then Norris and Ricciardo.
Yeah, I think. Yep. I actually had a couple of those lineups in my pool. Yep.
Like that's the scenario. It's basically gonna have to happen where there's that kind of big gap between the two teammates. I think in a given week, I really feel like Alpine and McLaren are probably going to be the only two teams where you're going to be able to stack the drivers and have a legitimate shot at that coming through for you. Because again, we talk about like the +5 for beating your teammate matters so much that that means your driver is going to have the secondary driver on the team is going to have to finish in the top 6 or 7. I still can never remember the points, but like they're going to have to finish in the top 6 or 7 to mitigate the head-to-head 5 points that Lance Stroll is going to get for finishing 16th when Vettel finishes 17th. But then that does happen, and if he finishes in, there's that possibility where if you're playing Ricciardo and he ends up in 6th place and Norris ends up on the podium, you might have a chance that week if you end up with like Leclair finishing first. Ferrari has a great week, and you end up with 2 guys who are in the top 6 or 5. So yeah, I mean, there will be possibilities. It's hard for me to imagine salary-wise it working out with any teams that are McLaren or Alpine.
Yeah, and again, no, like I said, I'm doing this in 5 to 10 out of 150 lineups. Yeah. Like if you're doing it in 5% of your lineups, I think you're okay. Again, the field's doing it 15%. I think that's probably too much. But if you're doing it in 10% of your lineups, I think you're giving yourself some outs. And we have this as the last note of the show, but since you brought it up, I'll just throw it out there really quickly. It does seem like that prioritizing those team winners over the top 10s is going to be more important. We saw on average about 4.5 plus 5s in top 1% lineups versus 4 drivers in the top 10. Obviously want drivers in the top 10, but the point is like jamming in a mid-salary driver that is starting 8th probably isn't as important as getting the Albon Stroll combo correct.
Right.
One other note on salary structure. We saw that this week, as we noted with the winning lineup, Pimple Popper MD left $1,500 on the table. We saw a third of the top 1% lineups leave at least $500 on the table. We saw 10% of them leave at least $1,000 on the table. But again, we're chasing that top lineup, right? And leaving $1,500 on the table, leaving $1,000 on the table is always going to be a really good way to separate. And I would venture as far as saying if I was only building one lineup every week, that would be the hard goal. I think I would, if I'm only building one lineup, I don't think I'm ever using all $50,000 in salary because if you're building a single lineup, you're probably always going to have Max or Leclair in that lineup. So if you need to separate, I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And again, it's still a lot of this stuff is new for me. And like the idea of leaving salary on the table is intimidating. Yeah. But we saw like these kinds of races are a lot more likely than just the everybody wrecks. And like you said, yes, Esteban Ocon, I think, won a race last year. Like you'll see 1 or 2 a year where somebody unusual ends up winning a race because of weird circumstances, or I'm praying we get a rain race this year. The rain race is going to make everything so chaotic and impossible that it's going to be fun to see what kind of iterations people come up with to win when that always makes things super unpredictable. But yeah, I mean, this kind of chaos, as we like to say, like I would assume at this point when we're talking chaos for the audience, chaos is going to mean that Red Bull and Ferrari, one of their drivers does not finish at least in like the top 5.
Yeah.
And outside the top 10. If both those drivers finish, if one driver from each of those teams finishes outside the top 10, it's going to create a lot more variables to getting you a winning lineup. If Leclerc and Verstappen finish 1-2, which like if it's anything like last year is going to happen most of the time with Hamilton and Verstappen, it is what it is. You're going to end up with a first place chop of 100 people or 50 people or whatever it is. But this kind of race is more common than the Ocon, Russell, Ricciardo podium is going to be.
Yeah, and we still haven't seen the big crash yet up front, right. and that's going to happen. And I'm wondering if now with Max not finishing 2 races, I wonder if we're going to see old Max now. Like if he's just going to start being as aggressive as he was with Lewis last year. Like I'm 35 points behind. If I'm not finishing, you're not finishing, Leclerc. And I know they're buddy right now, but Max will get wild out there. And I wonder after two races not finishing, if he's just going to say, hey, if I'm losing, I'm losing Max's way. And if he starts doing that, that's when like there's going to be a point where Max and Charles both don't finish, and that's going to be when stuff gets really crazy.
See, I tend to take a completely opposite view of it, and I'm glad you gave me that window to show this graphic that I stole from Reddit because this is the all-time biggest comebacks in Formula One history in terms of points. And this is, as you can see, adjusted to the way that the system is currently. Verstappen 46 points behind. He would be,
46.
He is 46 points behind. You can see there were some extenuating circumstances, and a couple of these in 1976, I believe, was one of the years. I think that was the year Niki Lauda crashed and missed a bunch of races and whatever. But like, I take a completely opposite perspective of it, because like I kind of did some of the math and looked it through. Last year was the closest drivers race we've ever seen, and Verstappen had 2 DNFs, an 18th and a 9th, and then finished every other race in first or second place. Like, his margin for error for winning the championship is essentially gone 3 races in, because he can't, I mean, okay, 18th is basically a DNF, but like, he basically has wiggle room for one more DNF or finish outside the points in 20 or 19 or 20 races. I think they're going to fill the Russia's seat somewhere. But like 20 more races, he's only got wiggle room for one really bad performance if he wants to really contend. Now, that said, of course, Ferrari hasn't contended for a title in a few years. There's always a chance that that car is going to backslide. There's also the chance that Mercedes is going to figure some things out, and maybe Hamilton starts winning some races and Russell gets faster, and suddenly we have 6 cars that can contend for the podium on a weekly basis. And maybe that, and Leclair, instead of finishing first or second every week, he's finishing 4th, 5th, or 6th. So things can happen, but Verstappen's racing style is going to be super interesting going forward, because I think his natural inclination is to be aggressive, although we saw him kind of learn from his mistakes and win in Saudi. But yeah, I just don't know how ultra aggressive he can be, particularly because he's got concerns about the reliability of the car. Like, he was, even before the car blew up, he had issues with his tires early on in the race. Like, there are issues. They are, like we've mentioned before, they are on their own powertrain right now. They are not using another company's engine. They're building their own engine. And we see, like, this week, AlphaTauri didn't have any problems, but we've seen AlphaTauri have problems with their engines. They're a Red Bull team as well. So I don't know that we're going to see that. And along those lines, like I tweeted this out the other day, I wouldn't tie up money for 6 or 7 months in a minus money future, but Leclair is like minus 150 to win the championship right now on DraftKings.
Wow.
And he should be minus 200 or something like that right now, like probably. And I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't tie that money up now, but I still think it's mispriced. Like, a lot's going to like, it's so crazy. Last year, greatest season ever, greatest championship fight ever, came down to the last race, drama, controversy, all of that. And then here we are 3 races into the following season, and he's got like one hand, and I'm not even being hyperbolic here. He legitimately does have like one hand on the World Drivers' Championship 3 races in. Now, like I said, like, a lot can happen, and we're going to head to Imola. We're heading like to the mainland Europe now, and teams have been hesitant to make too many changes to their cars because, as I'm sure you can imagine, the logistical nightmare of shipping something from England, where most of the teams are headquartered, to Australia is not the easiest thing in the world, whereas shipping it from England to Italy or Spain is a lot easier. So, like, that's the intrigue with the next race in Imola, is going to be teams are going to start rolling out their improvements and their changes to their cars over the next couple of weeks. So, or the next couple of races, because we're off this week. Thankfully, I'm going to completely out of pocket this weekend, so I'm glad there's no race. But yeah, and that's kind of the intrigue that we're going to see in the question marks for the next couple of races. But yeah, I mean, in the big picture of how all of this stuff is kind of played out, I mean, Charles Leclerc has a stranglehold on the World Drivers' Championship 3 races in. Like, another thing, I guess I should look this up at some point, is what is the fewest number of races a champion has ever won in a season? Because like George Russell's best finish is 3rd.
Yeah.
George Russell has 2 third places. Yeah, he finished 3rd.
Yeah, third in
fourth.
fourth in the first week, and then
3rd this week, and then he was somewhere around that. Like, and he's in 2nd place right now.
Yeah,
like that's how, and his car is just not as good as Leclerc's.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know why. And sorry, I got way off on that tangent.
No.
Like, one of the things I found
a great point,
most interesting, because we do kind of dive into the betting aspect of it a little bit. I didn't end up betting anything. I do want to. I'm not going to name them by name because we are friends with them and they are a business partner. But there is a sports book, a legal sports book, that listed match specials, race specials, and then took them down before qualifying and then didn't repost them after qualifying.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which thankfully saved me some money, because one of the ones that they had was Leclerc, Verstappen podium, Perez, Sainz top 6. at like plus 180. And I was like, well, I feel like that's pretty realistic. And I was going to bet it after qualifying, particularly after Sainz finished ninth, and then they never posted it again. So I will say I don't necessarily love that business practice, but we are seeing, you will see some of that stuff come up. I will say it was not DraftKings, and DraftKings actually had a pretty, I need to, hopefully I'll remind myself to like screenshot them just so that we can kind of keep track of what you could have won money on.
Yep.
They had all kinds, like their most robust race parlay section of the season were dozens upon dozens of Leclair to finish first. Now, a lot of them weren't great. Like most of them are not great options. It's like Leclair to finish first, Hamilton to finish second. It's like, well, I'm not going to bet on that. But like, if you're playing a lot of DFS and you're seeing, and I think that's where using the Run the Sims partnership can kind of help you also, because it's like, well, if you should be playing this, and it just kind of gives you percentages of how likely some things are to happen, then maybe you can formulate, a plan of, because I'm a sucker for any big number that I can get on a bet that I like I like big swings. It's hard for me to sit here and grind out a minus 110 winner at a time. Yeah. That's why I love betting golf. Because I can bet golfers at plus 30 to 1 and actually have a legitimate chance to win. And there's stuff like that. And you can bet 4 to 1 and 2 to 1. Like there are those kind of parlays out there too. But so shout out to them. And I'm hoping as the books get more data and have a better idea of what to expect, they're going to offer more fun kind of out there prop bets and parlays and whatever for these races. Again, they're not going to give you a lot where you're going to have great value on them, but some of them are going to be fun, and we'll try to highlight them and tweet them out as we see them and think that they're good. And hopefully as the season progresses, we'll see more of that.
Yeah. And in addition to Justin's ownership model that we are going to be highlighting every single week in the preview show, Sam Hoppin is also working on a betting model. So we are going to, when that's up and going, we will definitely be sharing that with subscribers. One thing that I want to note is if you are a 4for4 subscriber, we have been in the 4for4 Discord chatting about F1. And since we are doing our preview show after qualifying, I would encourage users to hop in there. You could sign up for the Discord in the YouTube description below. Before qualifying, Dan, you're talking about bets that you want to throw in there before you're up in the Discord giving those, and all of our guys will be in Discord talking about things that we want to be betting leading up to the race, and I think that probably outside of those matchup bets that are really exciting, I think that's where we're going to get our best numbers, right? If we're looking at these drivers before qualifying, before practice even, we saw lines moving like crazy after first practice this week. We saw lines moving like crazy. So would you say that if you're getting in there on Thursday is when you're going to get maybe some of the best juice?
It depends driver to driver. It's hard for me to advocate betting anyone other than like a price on Verstappen or Leclair to win a race before we see how the cars perform in practice and in qualifying. Obviously, where they finish in qualifying matters more than just about anything else. But like, it's an extreme example because I don't think I would have bet on him this week, but like Vettel had all kinds of problems all weekend long. Like the entire indication leading up to this race was that it was not going to be a good weekend for Sebastian Vettel, and it wasn't. On the flip side, the first week of the season, we saw Kevin Magnussen, back in the car for the first last minute replacement driver for the season for Haas. He had issues. He got one good qualifying lap in, but had issues with his engine leading up to the race, the days leading up to the race, and it was awesome in the race. It finished fifth. Mm-hmm. So some of that stuff's going to happen. Like any kind of betting stuff that you can have, you want to have the best information. It's just like, betting an NBA game. If they put up a line at, midnight for a 76ers Hawks regular season game, and Joel Embiid is listed as questionable on the injury report, you probably should wait until the information comes out whether or not he's going to play. You just, as a bettor, and the same thing as DFS. DFS, the same principle. Like when Yuki Tsunoda's having issues with his car, you're probably going to have to go and as quickly as you can adjust all of your lineups to take Yuki Tsunoda out of your lineups if possible. So you want the best information. Now you might, and it's just kind of like parsing data. It's okay. So this guy finished third in qualifying, but maybe there was something happened where like Verstappen in Saudi Arabia, his car was faster than it was in qualifying. He had a couple of little hiccups in qualifying where he didn't end up running his fastest lap, but it was pretty clear he was going to have the pace. Whereas in this race, like Leclerc's best lap was just that much better than everyone else's going into the race, and it just ended up bearing out that he was just by far the best car. Like, it wasn't even close. So it's you want to have as much data as possible, and that's why, like, hopefully the books will do a better will keep numbers up, or not keep numbers up, we'll adjust them. But if they offer something before practice and qualifying, they'll offer it afterwards and just adjust the line to the point where they're not scamming you, or because, like, it's taking, now granted, like, you know, it's immoral to let a sucker keep their money. If someone's going to make a bet on something before they have the best possible information at their disposal, that's on them.
Sure,
and like,
sure.
I can just tell you, like, hey, I saw this thing, I'm interested, I'm going to keep track and see if it's still there when we get to qualifying. It turns out it wasn't. But like I said, DraftKings, and I just usually stick to a couple of different. I'm in Connecticut. We have legal betting, but we don't have every single book. Our options are a little bit more limited than in other states. Shout out, like, just move to New Jersey, man. Like, you can bet on anything in New Jersey. You can bet on the Oscars in New Jersey. You can bet on the Oscars anywhere else legally in the United States, but, like, they'll have options. So, you know, it's price shopping. It's, you know, you want to get the best of the number and those kinds of things if you're really trying to win, or if you're just like me and you just want to, you know, have something to root for, throw a couple bucks here or there on a thing. Like, don't bet large sums of money on things that you don't have a lot of information on. But
Of course.
otherwise, like, yeah, I mean, it's always just going to be a matter of making sure that you have the most information at your disposal and the best possible information at your disposal, which you're just going to have after qualifying. Like, even practice, you know, like, I wouldn't even bet anything after free practice one, except, like, I wouldn't bet a ton, because the second practice session is going to be the one that they do at the time of the race. So, like, if you're looking to bet on, let me back up. If you're looking to bet on the race itself, I wouldn't bet anything from free practice one. Whereas if you look at free practice two, you kind of say, okay, well, that's when they're going to qualify. That's when they're going to run the race. Like, that time is going to be a little bit more representative, maybe what you can expect. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, it's just so tricky to make bets when you don't have the best information at your disposal.
Yeah, that's super fair. And when we do have all the information is after qualifying, and that is when we are doing the preview show. You know, noon Pacific time, 3 Eastern time after qualifying. So at the end of that show, we are firing off our 5 or 6 favorite bets. So you guys, if you are tuning in, you will be getting those. And again, if you do hop in the Discord, anything that changes between the end of that show and the race, we'll be talking about that in the Discord as well. Anything that you're looking forward to? We got 2 weeks off before the Italian Grand Prix. Any big notes that you're going to be thinking about, like what you're changing, what you hope changes, what you hope stays the same?
I'm just really interested to see how the teams start to unveil their new setups, their new changes, what they're going to do to try to make some changes to what their cars have done so far. Like, for a Ferrari, you're not going to have to make a ton of changes. They've got most things figured out. Like, the car was porpoising a little bit more than we've seen this weekend, but it didn't matter. Like, it didn't matter even a little bit. But the big thing is, can Mercedes, when they get to mainland Europe, they're not sandbagging, man. The car just hasn't been very good. It's been good enough. Like, it's been good enough for like 8 other teams on the grid, or for 7 other teams on the grid, but for where their aspirations are, not even close. So can they find the changes that they need to? And are we going to see it at Imola? Are they going to wait another week after that? Like, are we finally going to start to see some of what we've learned, these teams have learned about their cars through 3 races, really start to roll out some changes? And how is that going to change the complexion of what seems to be a pretty Ferrari, Red Bull dominant setup as we move forward into the bulk of the season?
Yeah, I'm from just a pure racing standpoint. I'm really excited to see qualifying. Actually, I want to see. I feel like Mercedes is trending in the right direction. I think at the very least they could start giving Red Bull fits. I don't know if they're gonna be able to catch Ferrari, but I think that's going to make for some really interesting decisions if they continue, and if McLaren is for real, if they are really going to be that 4th team instead of Alpine, that's going to make really exciting midfield racing. As far as DFS goes, I would implore anybody that is playing DFS to tweet at DraftKings and not yell at them, but politely suggest that they raise these salaries, because that is right now, it's just, if a driver is priced between 7,000 and 9,500, it's just almost impossible to use them. I mean, obviously we did see the Checo in that winning lineup, but it's just really hard to be have a lineup built around Mercedes or Alpine right now. And I think if you make it really hard to roster Leclair and Max, which right now it's really easy to do it, we're just not going to see these ownership percentages get spread out. So hopefully DraftKings tweaks that.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? I haven't ran through, the only data I haven't looked at this week was the duplicate data. I'm going to do that as soon as we get off, but I'm really interested to see salaries this week and to see how Mercedes and McLaren look in qualifying.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, the salary thing is so huge because you either end up with, we'd like to see a little bit more variance this week, and we're not going to get the kind of race that we got this week that often. Like it'll be more common than the one where we get a crazy podium, but the Verstappen, Leclair 1-2 in some order is going to be most weeks right now, it feels like. And even if you end up with Hamilton sneaking in some podiums regularly based on pace, it's still not going to be.
Is Hamilton Mercedes number one driver?
Well, yeah, I mean, he is, but hey, to Russell's credit, he's been extremely reliable. Like, this is what they were hoping for when they signed him, where Bottas he would just end up adrift every now and then, but like where Bottas, it's just like, well, he might finish second or third, or he might finish ninth or 10th. And Russell's been putting in those performances consistently. But yeah, I mean, you're either going to end up with like this was the chaos scenario that you can expect. And we finally got a break from the pack for once, but it would be cool if there was a way for them to kind of manipulate the salary structure such that it's more about just being strategically employing your drivers instead of just like needing kind of a weird, unlikely outcome for it to happen. Like that's hopefully what we're going to get to. We'll see if it gets there. I do think like the bottom of the grid is as important as the top. Like
it's fun.
You have to make Leclerc more expensive, and you also have to make Albon. Right now, you have to make Albon way more expensive than Latifi. I don't know if there's another team right now where there's like there needs to be that big of a gap, but particularly with Haas kind of coming back a little bit, or with Magnussen's car losing some of its speed. But yeah, I mean, hopefully they will continue to adjust and kind of see, because I think that's what we're kind of hoping for, without just the possible outcomes aren't numerous in Formula One. Even if every race is crazy, there's only 20 drivers. It's not like this is the NFL, which has a player pool of like 500. I don't know how many players are.
Yeah, I would like to see the highest. I would like to see Leclerc price where it costs about 17. If it costs about 17.5 to captain him, and you get the floors up to 4K, that's where I think we would really see some exciting stuff. But either way, no matter what DraftKings does, we are going to be here in 2 weeks to give you the preview for the Italian Grand Prix, going over all of this stuff that we talked about in the recap. We will be giving it to you in an actionable format for how we're going to apply it to the race in 2 Saturdays. Of course, we are going to be doing that with the projections and the optimal ownership rates from Run the Sims. If you haven't signed up for Run the Sims yet, go to runthesims.com and use promo code 4for4 to get 10% off both the USFL and the F1 deals with projections tools and content for both DFS and betting. You can also just click on the link in the description. The other link in the description is to get your subscription to 4for4. You can get a free 4for4 Pro subscription by depositing at least $10 on Underdog Fantasy using the promo code 4for4. You'll also get a bonus deposit match up to $100. You must be a new Underdog user. Again, that link is in the description, and we have some great series coming out on the biggest tournament of the year, the Underdog Best Ball Mania. We have tools for that already on the site. Those are free, so go to 4for4, check that out. Be sure you're keeping an eye on my Twitter for that article series that is set to launch. Sign up for the 4for4 betting plan, still early bird rates there. We launched BetSperts Golf very successfully, had a great Masters week, so make sure you're signed up for BetSperts Golf. Keep an eye out for the BetSperts bundle, which is coming soon, which will get you access to all BetSperts properties for one low price. Please, if you're listening, give us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or Spotify. If you are watching, please like this video, like our channel, and subscribe and give us a good review on here. And you can follow all of us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4football. BetSperts is at BetSpertsGolf. Dan is at Really Dan Weiner. Run the Sims is at Run the Sims. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you guys in 2 weeks.